Well, good afternoon, and we're going to enter into our panel discussion. We've gathered a number of our best thinkers in the Church of the Nazarene and elsewhere to help us think through this process of funding in the local church. My name is Bill Sawyer, and I'm the Chief Administrative Officer for the Global Ministry Center here in Lenexa. I've been doing that. I'm a real veteran now. I've been there about 6 months. Prior to that, I spent 25 years in business. 18 years of those were spent in financial services. I worked for a division of Goldman Sachs and worked in various capacities there in the financial services arena, and then was also, I guess what we're calling it now, a bi-professional pastor, a bi-vocational pastor. I was ordained 20 years ago and pastored for a couple of years full-time, but for 9 years, the past 9 years prior to coming here, I was a pastor of Santa Ana First Church on the weekends. And it was a multicultural church in Southern California and a multi-congregational church, multi-staff. And that was a brave new pathway for me to participate in as the laity and the staff really did a lot of the ministry. So glad to be here. When I was thinking of this whole panel conversation, I went back to some of the experiences that I've had in business. And in 2008, there were some huge things that really began to change because of the global downturn in the economy. As we gathered together as a company, the company that I was working for, TransUnion, we began to proactively think about how we were going to manage the change in the revenue stream. And one of the things that we did is we got together for what we called economic summits with other people in the financial industry. And we brought industry leaders together to have a discussion so that we could begin to rethink, reimagine our future and come up with a better way to build a sustainable revenue model in an environment that changed for us globally, locally, and changed politically and regulatory, every way that you could imagine. And we're facing those same kind of things in the church. It's affected us. We're not going to go back to 2008 and what it was like before 2008. It's a brave new world. And we need to think about how we will do funding in the future in the local church. And that's why we have this panel here today to help us with that discussion. We have about an hour for the discussion. We have some pre-prepared questions that they already have had access to. And we'll try to move through this and allow each one to speak. And we'll have some other questions that we may be able to ask at the end, depending on how long it goes. When you think about the greater context, I just want to say this. When it comes to giving in America, at least, we're still a giving church. $335 billion was given to religious organizations over the last few years. And Americans like to give. They're just giving differently than they have in the past. And a lot of that is not making it to the local church. And so we're going to talk about some of these issues today. And with that being said, we'll move forward here. And Christopher is an author and a CEO, and Cliff, and we are going to ask the first question of you. In the preface to your revision of Not Your Parents' Offering Plate, you cite an illustration of a couple who chose to give a significant gift to their local church, but then they gave a mega gift to a university. The reasoning behind their decision-making is compelling. Would you mind sharing that story with us this afternoon and how it illustrates the problem facing local churches in the area of giving?
Well, I'd be happy to share it. Probably it'll take up about an hour, and I know the rest of the panel won't mind. But what happened with this particular instance, Horizon Stewardship Company, of which I am the founder and CEO, was running a $12 million capital campaign for a rather large church. In the midst of that, one of the families stepped forward and said they wanted to make a contribution of $300,000. Pastor was elated, joyful, dancing on the ceiling. $300,000 sounded really good to him. And he thought that'd be a great lead, and he called me, and he was effusive. Told me who the couple was, and I was very disappointed. this couple, I thought, had significantly more strength than that, and they had jumped in quickly and sort of made sure they got themselves off the hook with $300,000. About 2 weeks after that gift was announced, on the front page of the statewide newspaper was a picture of this couple standing on each side of the chancellor of the university, who was thanking them for a $6 million gift to the art department of this secular university. I was most intrigued. Here, 2 gifts were just made by the same couple, $300,000 to one, and then a gift 20 times larger to the art department of the university. This couple I've known for decades. I know them to sit on the 4th row center aisle of their church, and they have sat there for 40 years. Very, very faithful church members, and they just gave a massive gift to someplace other than this church they've been in. I called him up, said, I want to talk to you. Went over to his house that afternoon, sat in his living room, and basically just got right to it. And I told him, I said, his name is Jim, and I said, Jim, I said, let's just, to make things simple, pretend we got a bucket here. And in this bucket, you've got your money. I said, now, I don't know how much money you got. But I said, I know you got at least $6.3 million. And so I'm going to put $6.3 million in this bucket. And now you've got 2 choices as to how you're going to dispense of it. You just made a decision. $300,000 went to the church, $6 million went to the university. Tell me why. Well, we sat there for an hour as he explained it. But I guess what I want you to hear, and then certainly we can get on to others' questions. His reason for doing it is that his primary mission in life as a servant and as a steward of God, who believed that God had given to him everything he had, and it was his job to make sure he did not show up to heaven with a huge net worth. He wanted to give his money away in accordance with how he felt God would have him do. And he said, what God has said to me is, you need to change as many lives as you possibly can. And I firmly believe the university is going to affect and change the lives of young people better than the church. Mm-hmm. Wow. Now, he has sat in a pew for 40 years. I talked about how he came to that conclusion, and he discussed the year-long relationship he had had with the president. He discussed how he had met with students and how they had shared about their life-changing experience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he went through all of that, but it was all based around the passion of wanting to change lives. I asked him how many pastors he had had in his tenure at this church. 7. How many pastors have ever sat with you and talked to you about the blessing of wealth, the gift of money that you and your wife have been given, how you want to affect the world, and how the church might participate in making your vision a reality? Has any pastor ever done that with you? Any of the 7? And he quickly said, no. But Cliff, preachers don't want to talk about money. He was saying it as, I'm not offended that they didn't do it. I know they don't do that sort of thing. But there was one who did do that sort of thing, the president of the university, and it got him a gift 20 times as large. I think there's something to learn there.
That's right. Well, if the church is having trouble making this compelling story to potential contributors, Dan, let me ask this question of you. Why should they give? What's the problem? Is it because we're not doing our job, or because we don't know how to tell the story, or is there something else? What are the factors that play into it? You're the education commissioner.
We're not doing our job. That's the question. Are we doing our job? I guess I'd start by, asking all of us. We've been here for a few hours already. We're talking about this large topic that just weighs on all of us, local congregations, local pastors, districts in support of congregations, and a general church in support of local congregations, and educational enterprise in support of establishing nurturing leaders that will enter into local congregations. So I guess I'd ask us, are we happy with the way it's going? Anybody happy with, we're doing a fine job when it comes to the stewardship of the resources that God has given? Anybody happy with that? So I think part of what I would say is it's all of our responsibility. It's not the local pastor, it's not the district, it's not the Global Ministry Center, it's not the education enterprise. It's all of our responsibility. And so I'm just very thankful that we are gathered together, and want to commend NTS and the Center for Pastoral Leadership and those that are supporting, and all of us that have taken time and effort and expense to be here to have this conversation. So when I go back to think about that question, we come from Scripture and a tradition that says to us, we are stewards of all that God provides. Stewards of creation, stewards of material wealth. We're stewards. What does that say to us as leaders in the church? I would say there's another one that talked about stewarding financial wealth, stewarding material blessing, and that was Jesus himself. And so how I as a pastor cannot feel compelled to call my people to stewarding whatever resources God has blessed them with. That's part of the responsibility of a pastor. It's part of the responsibility of clergy. It's part of the responsibility of laity. And it sounds like what the lay leader who gave the monies, what they were hearing was not the story of Scripture. The story of Scripture is one of gospel story. The story of transformation, the story of life change, and through life change, the story of community change. And so it seems to me that in answer to the question, it seems to me that we all need to work together to reflect on how is it that we're not sharing as a denomination, as educational enterprise, as district, as local pastors, we're not sharing the compelling story of Jesus in such a way that people are seeing the potential for life change and then willing to sacrifice to be a part of that. And it goes far more than local offerings and far deeper than supporting schools or the mission of the church around the world. It really goes to stewarding whatever it is God gives to us. Where Molly Marshall was talking about the foolishness and faith, I think as leaders in the church, laity and clergy, we live on that precipice of faith and foolishness. And there are times when it seems foolish to the world, but it is faith. And faith, I think, calls us to trust God that for education, for the local church, for the mission around the world, His resources are not inadequate. He's given it to us. What does it mean for us to be stewards? So I guess the way I would answer that question is, we're not doing the job that we need to do. I would invite all of us to consider how we do that together. And I think I would just call us together to lock arms to think about this and commit to this. And not a local church say to the district, we don't need to be a part of this, or a district say to a local church, you're going to be a part of this, or a school, oftentimes we kind of blame each other, I think. And this is something we've got to lock our arms in together. What does it mean to be stewards of the resources God has given us for the mission of God through the Church of the Nazarene, through the local church, in support by districts, educational enterprise, the general church?
Very good. Megan, you represent pastoral ministry, and so I know you're pastoring a new kind of church, and we're glad to have you here with us this afternoon. When we think about tithing, that's really been the traditional way of doing things to fund the church. And when you look at the model, about 7.4%, I think, is what I heard, are actually tithing of the people that are attending church. So a lot of folks are not tithing. So do you think that tithing is still relevant in the model that we're moving into in this new age? And does your work as a bivocational or biprofessional pastor in a house church impact your view of how we fund the church?
Well, I don't think tithing is fully relevant insofar as we can assume that people know what tithing is, what it's for, what it does, and why they should be a part of it. So as a pastor and as pastors, I think that we've talked about tithing and giving, as has already been said, in ways that are very thin and not very compelling. We've talked about it in a lot of ways, but here's at least 3 that I've remembered that are very strong in the front of my mind. One is the tithe, the obligatory 10%. So you give the 10%, and then the other 90 is yours. It can be my money, and Jesus has very little or nothing to say then about that other 90%. Another way we've talked about tithing is, unfortunately, in my view, and I hope in the view of us Wesleyans, really toting the prosperity gospel line. So that giving to God, giving to the church, is really just about what I'm going to get, how I'm going to be blessed, which just perpetuates this really individualistic picture of giving that looks not at all different from another kind of investment that you might make financially. The third way is the Stewardship Sunday, which is this kind of, we're not going to talk about it except for the one day a year, and I'm going to give so much warning that everyone's ready for it because I'm so uncomfortable as the pastor. And so we only talk about it once a year when it's absolutely necessary, and you can't form a community that thinks about giving if you only talk about it once a year. We're here to talk about money. And if there's one thing in this culture that holds us captive, one power of evil, it is money. And so if we're not redescribing the practice of tithing and giving to the local church in a way that's compelling, why be about it? If it's just the 10%, or just so I can be blessed, or just on Stewardship Sunday. Instead, as a pastor, in teaching and preaching throughout the whole of the year, and thankfully a lot of scripture has to do with money, or how the earth is the Lord's, or how God chose to live in a tent instead of a house. All year long, we have these opportunities to redescribe giving in compelling language so that people give because it frees them from the power of money that holds them captive. How else can we be free unless we give back to God what is God's? So giving money is participating in the work of Christ, the work that Christ did on the cross, freeing us from the power of death. So much of the work for the local pastor is learning how to tell the right story and make sure we're telling it all year long. I'll say a couple other things about my context. Because I do pastor a church that meets in people's homes, our overhead is staff. So imagine your church budget, and if it had no building expenses, all of the upkeep stuff that we saw in the video, I can pastor a small church and get paid. Yes, I am also bivocational, as so many of us are. But I can pastor a church and be paid because our church doesn't have a building. We meet in people's homes, and in the summer we meet in the park. There's no fee to go to the park. You just show up and do church. And people stare at you a little bit. They wonder what's going on, but that's just an opportunity to have a conversation.
That's exactly it. Very good. Thank you, Megan. What a great perspective. So, Jerry, the next question is for you. And giving from large churches represents a significant portion of the giving to the general church for the Church of the Nazarene. So on your district and across the church, do you see any trends that might indicate that large churches are going through some financial struggles and strain? And in addition, many pastors don't see fundraising as part of their ministry role. What do you say to pastors who are uncomfortable? We've heard about that already from other speakers. That are uncomfortable with the responsibility and fear of being perceived maybe as a money grubber or something not positive.
So there were about 14 good questions there.
That's right.
So the first one deals with how a pastor views support for the general church. When I first came to Washington Pacific District, we were number 72 in terms of percentage of support for the world evangelism out of 80 districts, USA, Canada. And at the top of our district in terms of church size, we had a church of 2,500 that had made it clear that the World Evangelism Fund, pensions and benefits, our local university and the district were a waste of money, and they could support ministries directly better than if they funneled those things through our denominational resources. That's the thing, that was my introduction to be a DS. So we arranged an annulment with that congregation, because that's unacceptable. We're a collective church. We operate collectively. When we accepted ordination in the Church of the Nazarene, we understood what that meant, that we were going to work collectively worldwide, that we weren't a nationalized church even. We were an international church, and we had connections that were appropriate. And so I met several times with that pastor, and then just determined that that relationship was not healthy for the Washington Pacific District, nor was it healthy for that local church. With the support of the General Superintendent in jurisdiction, we figured out a way to let that congregation leave the church. So my first official act as a district superintendent was to reduce the Sunday morning attendance on Washington Pacific by 2,500. When they did not announce to the congregation that they were leaving the Church of the Nazarene, because they would have first had to explain what the Church of the Nazarene was in order to leave the denomination. So we've left amicably, and we blessed them and they blessed us, but that's unacceptable. So everybody on WAPAC knows that for this district superintendent anyway, support for the World Evangelism Fund is an expectation. It's not acceptable to just say, well, that's a decision I'll make or not make. So, and that action would probably clearly indicate that. So we've been able to build on a foundation of expectations that we all have for one another. But sometimes it's difficult for a large church to meet the obligation of World Evangelism Fund, particularly if the local church has a capital campaign. If the capital campaign results in a 5.5% responsibility for World Evangelism Fund, and then the other that come to 10, and then our district support is 3%. It's a total of 13% that's expected of the church out of the capital campaign that they raise according to our current configuration. That's extremely difficult for a large church if they raise an extra $1.5 million a year in a capital campaign, because normally you can't explain that to people giving to a capital campaign. It's very difficult. So this last year, we had one of our large churches had an extra $1 million of income based on a capital campaign. And we came to district assembly, and as district superintendents know, sometimes you don't know. You don't know until the last minute what somebody is actually doing in terms of World Evangelism Fund, nor what their total income is, sometimes until the last couple of weeks before assembly. 2 weeks before assembly, I realized that I had two churches, significant size, that were not going to reach the 100% mark, at least, in raising World Evangelism Fund. We needed some wins on Washington Pacific. We just did. The 2 prior years, we'd been able to pay the World Evangelism Fund in full for the first time since 1981. We needed to do it a 3rd year in a row, in my mind, in order to sustain the momentum we were gaining in the work we were doing together. So I sent letters to 2 pastors saying, would you please call an emergency meeting of your local church board? Would you tell them that we do this collectively, because they don't always understand. A local church board does not always understand that their board can decide whether or not the entire district can meet its responsibility that we've all agreed to. Does that make sense? I sent back a letter that said, would you explain to your local church board that they've created a $70,000 deficit in what we want to do collectively as a district in order to reach the responsibility we feel for supporting the work of the church around the world? Would you tell them that, and I asked it very nicely. Both of those pastors went back to their local church board and said, let me read you a letter from the district superintendent. And they did. And both of those churches decided that what they would do would be they would rearrange their local budget and they would support World Evangelism Fund so that we could meet that obligation. I don't know how many times I can go to that well, but I was prepared to pay it out of district reserves because I thought it was so important that we understand together that we're not individual churches, we're not independent churches. That's not what you got. That's not the bus you got on. The bus you got on was that we have a collective understanding and responsibility for the work of the church around the world. We're not a nationalized church. We're not a district church. We're not a local church. We're an international church with responsibility. And so I guess I don't let pastors off the hook when it comes to what we all agreed to do. And after assembly, I said to both those pastors, are we still friends? And they both smiled and said, absolutely. Because in their heart, they wanted to be able to do what we were able to do. But the way that I helped them is for 5 of our churches that it just became clear to me early on that if we were going to make our responsibilities that we'd agreed to do, I needed these 5 churches to participate, and they were not at the level they needed to be. So I arranged for meetings with Vern Ward. I just let Vern come to talk to local church boards himself, make his own case. And then I asked church boards, would you please make the cost-benefit analysis? Is this worth the money we're paying? Is this worth it? And to a board, they said, no, that's important. So I let Vern make his own case. This year I have Philly Malchambo coming to make his own case with the 2 churches last year that struggled. He'll meet with the boards of those churches and make his case directly, and then they can ask whether the cost-benefit analysis works. The other thing, am I going over?
You're doing good.
Okay. I can dominate class discussion. The other thing we did, Deborah Velker and I, I'm my missions president, we intentionally blurred the lines between NMI and the district. So we don't do NMI convention and district assembly, we just simply blurred it, put it together, so we'll have a pastor's report and a report from a missionary that just follow one another so that we understand that it's all the same mission. It's just the same mission. And that's part of the strategy we've used to last year WAPAC sent just a couple of dollars over $1 million to World Evangelism Fund.
Wow, that's tremendous. Wow. Thank you, Lord. Yeah. Well, that brings to mind some Wesleyan thoughts. And Megan, you had mentioned something a minute ago about the 90-10, the 10%, and then the 90 is for whatever you want to do with it. That's really not our Wesleyan heritage. There's a lot in our theology that speaks to giving ourselves fully to the Lord, and that includes all of our resources. And so, Carla, as the president of NTS, How does our Wesleyan doctrine fit in to this whole thing, and how pastors and churches can do a better job of teaching and be better stewards of our time and our possessions? How does that play in, and what are you doing in that realm?
Well, a loaded question,
It
again.
is, yeah.
One of the things I think about with Wesley, and people attribute it to him, is the phrase of earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can.
Yeah.
And one day with a donor, the lady said, and spend all you can. But that was... But that idea from Wesley, I think it is just embedded in who he is and what his life was about. He worked incredibly hard, and that is part of the Wesleyan ethos that we get. We are and should be hardworking people. So we do earn all that we can, and I think realizing there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Now, I think that sometimes we've thought that there was something wrong with that. I think that sometimes in our ministry and our holiness background and ministering to the people on the other side of the tracks, that sometimes we've thought, well, maybe it's bad to actually be financially successful. And I think God has called some people to be financially successful. So working hard, earn all you can, but then to save all you can. It doesn't mean that we earn all of that to be living on all of that.
Yeah.
And so then to share and give away everything that we can, it's so much more than that 10% tithe. And I think understanding the holistic lifestyle of what that means. Now, here we are at NTS, and so obviously I have an interest in terms of what we're doing with theological education. One of the things that I've heard from pretty much everybody here is telling our story is vitally, vitally important. I think Wesley was really good at telling the story, to connect the dots on how we put those pieces together. In terms of education, I think that education is absolutely vital for us to be able to pass on this idea of giving and how it becomes part of our lifestyle and part of our practice. I was thinking about this in terms of NTS, and every now and then I'll go to Dale Jones's office and say, can you give me some statistics? And I find this fascinating because it's not that we here at NTS have really focused historically on the aspects of giving, but an NTS alum pastoring a church in USA or Canada is twice as likely to pay 100% of WEF than any other pastor. Yeah, those were the stats you gave me. An NTS alum is twice as likely to pay 100% of WEF. Now, I'm not sure that that's because we studied Wesleyan giving in class. I think it's our story. I think there's something that happened in this place that connected us to the broader story, that said, I am part of this whole experience, and therefore I'm going to support this whole experience. Jerry, you're talking about how to bring voices in to help make that connection. So if that's part of the connection that we're losing, we have to figure out how we do that. It goes back, yes, to Wesley. We're part of a community of faith. My focus is on incredible love of God, therefore I love my neighbor. I am going to give to my church because of that Wesleyan connection. That's where I'm going to have my focus first. So I think there's great stuff that, yes, we can preach about. There are great educational tools. And can I just throw on my DS hat here a minute? We were talking down here about how do we help out there. I was on the pension board, and now you can shoot me if I'm wrong on this one, but didn't we have about 500 pastors in the United States who were not involved in the pension plan because they didn't sign the paper? It was 1,000. So, we hear these statistics and we say we are so bad. Let me just say, we actually have tools. We have things available for pastors. How do we educate so that people would actually do what it is that we have provided?
Yeah.
That's a concern as well.
Yeah, good point. Very good point. Thank you, Carla. Don Walter, you're the Director of Nazarene Pensions and Benefits, and in a recent newsletter, you mentioned that our denomination is top-heavy on pastors that are nearing the retirement age, and their financial preparation for retirement is woefully inadequate, I think is how you phrased it. How's that affecting the church, and is there anything that you feel like we can do about that?
Well, we do have right now an interesting convergence of some dynamics, economic and demographic. And economists like to talk about leading indicators. We heard earlier about a canary in a mine. I think the convergence of these two elements could be a leading indicator of some things to come. But right now, based on the data that we have, and I think Dale would, I think we got it from the same sources you get it, but about 45% of our current senior pastors and full-time associates are age 45 or older. In fact, of that group, the single largest age group is 65 plus. So we have an aging workforce. That doesn't make us unique. Throughout USA, in general, we do have an aging workforce. The Bureau of Labor Statistics indicates that in the year 2022, which isn't that far away, approximately 32% of the age group 65 to 74 will still be working. And they are anticipating that at age 75, 10% will still be working. Most of that will be driven by economics. And most of that is due to the fact that there has not been adequate financial preparation on the part of individuals for the future. There are a lot of things that contribute to that. It's not simply lower salaries, because low compensation is not a direct corollary to not saving for retirement. Some folks who are not well compensated exhibit wonderful behaviors in terms of preparing for the future. Interestingly enough, when we look at the data, a number who are well compensated aren't doing anything about the future. But the reality is that when we did a study last year with both Willis Towers Watson, which is a consulting firm, and then took very much similar data and had Fidelity Investments look at it. Fidelity's our provider for the 403B plan, the retirement plan. Came to the conclusion that about 74% of our current senior pastors and full-time associates will need to work to age 72 in order to be able to have an adequate retirement. So we have right now begun to experience some of the consequences of what we haven't done in the last 25 or 30 years. And waiting to fund retirement until you're in your 60s and 70s is not a good strategy. In fact, it's a strategy that will not work. So what we're facing is this reality that we have an aging workforce. The workforce is not financially prepared to retire, and so we're going to have to be working through that. That's probably a personnel issue more than an economic issue, but the two are closely tied. I'm not sure what the solution is. I know whatever solution there is, it has a big price tag attached to it. But I also know that this is not a sustainable pattern for 10 to 15 years, because you can delay retirement, but you can't delay death. And to the extent that we do not have in the pipeline coming behind us clergy in the age group to replace, that's a challenge. But we're also seeing the same behaviors with our younger clergy as we have seen now with our aging clergy. In fact, the data that we looked at said that people in their 60s probably have exhibited savings patterns that will enable them to retire somewhere around 71, 72. But people in their 30s are exhibiting savings patterns for retirement that will enable them to retire at about age 76. So we haven't really solved the problem. We are perpetuating the problem. And it is an issue that is not just a clergy finance issue. This is a local church ministerial supply issue. And once we begin to look at it beyond just the dollars and understand what it means for us as a denomination, as a church, and what we need to be doing in order to address it. You see, the problem with not saving money for retirement does not present itself within the first 5 years of retirement. It presents itself in the last 10 years of retirement when you've run out of money. And at that point, it's too late. And our actuaries tell us that a couple age 65 today can expect that one of them will still be alive at age 92. There's a 25% chance that one of them will be alive at age 92. Gentlemen, unfortunately, that will not be us. And if we have not prepared adequately, the problem will not be something that shows up within the first 5 years after retirement. It will show up later, and it probably is going to be, if things don't change, an issue of a lot of widows without resources in about 15 to 20 years. So, if that doesn't take the oxygen out of the room, I don't know what will, but it's a gift.
Yes. All right. Jerry, I want to go back to something you said earlier. You were talking about a couple of churches that, and I'll throw it open to you, Jerry, and to everybody on the panel so we can kind of enter into more of a group discussion here. But you kind of mentioned that the pastors really didn't feel as comfortable about talking about general church issues. And it seems like that's almost a trend now where there's not as much focus on general church giving, World Evangelism Fund, you brought that up. And that churches seem like they're more interested in giving to local causes and to the mission that's here in the U.S., if it's a U.S. church. So if that's an accurate assessment, and you can start, Jerry, and then anybody else can jump into it. What advice do you have for the general church and what we do to kind of correct that situation and help in the giving for the mission that is all around the globe and not just the local church?
Well, first I think that churches need to be appreciated for what they do. And I think sometimes in our system, because, and I was thinking, you say what you say and then you think about what you said, and I was thinking about the way I said what I said. It sounded like I was saying, this is the expectation and you need to do it. And I'm not going to back away from that. This is the expectation and we need to do it. We all agreed to do it, and this is what we should do. But the way you sell it is not that way. The way you sell it is by you de-institutionalize the World Evangelism Fund and you personalize it.
That's right.
So it's really hard to, I don't know how well you know Philly, but it's hard to have Philly Chambo in your board meeting telling your board what he's doing in Africa where the church is exploding and have the board go, yeah, well, that's not important. In fact, in one of the board meetings where Vern was present, Vern communicated to this local church board, most of them non-Nazarene. The only church of the Nazarene they've been a part of in a large church is that church. And so Vern sat and he shared the story of what was happening in the World Evangelism Program and parts he was specifically involved in right then. And I just loved it when one of the board members said, "Pastor, why haven't you told us about this?" And I just looked at the pastor and went, but I think the answer is to personalize it. If it's an institutional responsibility, it's never going to be for some pastors anything but a tax. But if it's Philly Chambo saying this is what's happening in Africa, and we get to support it, that's a whole different story. That's where the strength comes. But I do think we're going to have to do more of allowing large churches the ability to designate where their money goes. It's easier for them to do that. The church I'm describing has an incredibly large mission in Malawi. And so they'd already given enough to Malawi to make up what their shortfall was for the capital campaign that they had. They could have, those were almost a wash. So I began to go to J.K. Warwick and say, can we use these as WEF dollars? They've already paid those. And he said, because he doesn't want local churches to begin to determine where WEF goes. So he said, y'all have to call Philly. So he called Philly Chambo, and I'm waiting to find out whether or not this is going to work. And it's like 2 days before assembly. And Philly said, I can't let a church in the U.S. determine the mission in Africa. That doesn't work. So no. So we had to find the dollars some other way. But I think we're going to have to address the issue of when a large church is raising large dollars and they need to personalize those dollars in order to raise them. We're going to have to find a better way than just to say this is your institutional responsibility. There's going to have to be a way that we can somehow create a system of point-to-point giving for large churches where they fulfill point-to-point what Philly's mission was in Africa. Does that make sense?
It does. You know, and I think that's a great point, Jerry, and you've got a great situation with Philly coming in and talking to a church board, but when I think about this in a broader spectrum, and I throw this open to the rest of the panel, what do you think we can do on a larger scale from a general church perspective to help in getting the story out? Dan?
I resonate with what everybody's saying about telling the story. That was the key as a pastor. And I won't tell the stories, but many times we face financial challenges, and the more of the story and the invitation, the more people responded. It wasn't that we were without resources, it was the compelling story. Short time as a district superintendent. So now 5 years I've been working with a global church, and I wish I could take every USA, Canada, or global member of the Church of the Nazarene into some of these stories. Now, that means, to answer your question, I need to be better at telling the story. And I'm working at that. But I think we as a denomination need to be better. I'll tell you one story. I just met recently with a year ago, with the European Nazarene College board and faculty. They now have no campus. They've sold the campus in Boozingen. They now have 17 centers across East and West Europe training clergy in their language, in their context, to be pastors all over Eastern and Western Europe. 17 centers, now 300 students, where the most students they ever had on the campus was 50, and you had to study in English, and many times didn't go back to your original home or context. So here I am meeting with the board, and the board is made up of members of each of those centers. And so I'm looking at this young man and woman sitting across from me, and they're speaking a language. I think it's Russian, but I'm there as the education commissioner to sit in on the board meeting of European Nazarene College. And I don't know these two people. And so as they conclude their conversation, I lean forward and I said, I'd like to get acquainted. My name's Dan. I'm the education commissioner and here just to see how we can support what you're doing here at EUNC. They introduced themselves. Alex. He works with the center in Moscow, Russia. Svetlana works with the center in Ukraine. Let that sink in for a moment. In the geopolitical world in which they live and their households function and their economies function, we have sitting at the table leaders in the Church of the Nazarene that are praying together, dreaming together, learning together about what it means to raise up kingdom leaders in Ukraine and in Russia, sister and brother together. I wish every Nazarene in the world could have sat in on that conversation. I walk away and Lord, I don't have the wisdom to be steward of what I just heard. I don't know how to retell that story in a way that it hit me when I just sat in on it. And that's one of many. And so I think as a denomination, the story is there. The Feelys are there. The Verns are there. Vern will tell you, I talked to him yesterday. We are now planting, over the last 6 years, nearly 1,400 churches all around the world, each year. What one local church can say, we can do what our connection as a global church can do. We can equal that. We are planting over nearly 1,400 churches a year over the last 6 years. I remember I'll tell you one story. I remember sitting in a board meeting. I was a local church pastor. Our church had felt God give us this miracle to buy this building in the middle of a church year, not in budget. We bought the building. Within a few weeks, we had a mortgage payment we'd never budgeted for. We came to the end of the church year. We had 3 months left, and we were 6 months behind on our obligations, our commitment to our district, and our commitment to Point Loma, and our commitment to the global mission. We're 6 months behind, and we sat in a meeting, and great lay leaders and pastors wrestling with and saying, maybe this is the 1 year, Pastor Dan, that we are not able to fulfill all these obligations. I mean, as a matter of fact, nobody knew we'd have this miracle to buy this building. And I just listen in the conversation. Great leaders in the church. Maybe this is the year it's an exception. And all I said was, well, I should say the chair of the committee turned to me and said, Pastor Dan, do you have anything to say? And I just looked and I said, this is really great conversation. But I said a few months ago, we all were compelled that God really miraculously provided us this opportunity to buy this building adjacent to our property. Right? Yes. I said, I just don't think God is honored by us paying our mortgage and backing out on our commitments to being a part of the global mission, to our school right here in our neighborhood, and to the work of our district that we're a part of. I just don't think God's honored by that. That's how the meeting ended. Now, to make a long story short, we were able to complete that. People stepped up and did it. And the great news is nobody could explain it. The treasurer's report to the board was, I can't explain it. There's no special big gifts. We just started paying as if we only had 3 months left to pay on the 6 months. And here we just sent in the last check. He said, you know, Dan, Pastor Dan has been talking about kingdomnomics. He said, all I can say is, and he was a finance person, it was really frustrating for him. He said, all I can say is this is that kingdomnomics stuff. I believe the resources are there. And it's the story and calling our people as a pastor, as a district superintendent, telling the global story. I believe people still respond to the story that is compelling.
Can I jump in?
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you for that passion and a great story. And I was sitting here listening to you thinking, I don't know where, and maybe I'm wrong in this, but you talked about the Church of the Nazarene, that in some ways we kind of have bought into a negative narrative about ourselves sometimes.
I agree, yeah.
And we've just kind of become downers. And in some ways, when we got the new budget formula, we went from general budget giving to now I have a tax to pay. I've had people tell me that. That's a really negative way of looking at the ways in which we get to participate in God's mission in this world. And instead of looking at it that way, we do have to get back into telling the story because there are amazing things that are happening. Now, I'm going to just say something you guys are going to think I'm crazy on as well. You said, how do you do this? If you historically look at how missions money has been raised by all denominations, it was raised by the women. And the reality is, if you want to figure out how to raise the money in your church, women are the ones making the decisions in the homes about giving. And the women that ran the NMI and all of that, our structure isn't working quite like we had in the past. But I'm stepping out here to say, get the women engaged in raising money and you're going to make a difference. And that's going to happen for the church. And I think that part of what's happened in some of the changes, we're sending all the information to the pastors, and many of the pastors are a lot of, well, you guys. And you have enough on your plate and you're overwhelmed. And I'm saying empower a bunch of the women in your church to raise the money and you might just be surprised.
Preach it, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, got it, yeah. I think you're
You,
right.
you correctly have identified where the story has to be told, though, Carla, and that is that if the pastor of a local church doesn't believe in the worldwide connection of the Church of the Nazarene, we're all sunk. If the local pastor just doesn't believe it, it's never going to get any traction in the local church. So as a district superintendent, my responsibility is to remind pastors and then encourage them to do the cost-benefit analysis of all that we've just heard about what's going on around the world. It's a great thing.
Great. Well, I believe that we're about at the end of the time here, and I don't want to cut anybody off. You all have done a great job. We appreciate the panel and your expertise as we haven't really solved all of our problems. That's not the purpose of this. The purpose was to help us rethink things so that we can put strategies together and prepare better for the future as a church and fulfilling our mission. So, Dr. Middendorf.
Thank you.